Hello, good morning. Today our guest is Omer Ozak. Hello, Omer. How are you doing?
Fine, thank you.
Omer, tell us a little about yourself and your line of research.
Um, well, of myself, you want like a full history of my life,
Your
or like
professional life, your professional
um,
life.
well, I did my undergrad back in Colombia at the Universidad Nacional in economics, and then I did a master's in math also at the same university, and then I moved to the US to do my PhD in economics at Brown University, and then from then I've been basically all the time at Southern Methodist University, first as an assistant professor, and now as an associate professor in economics.
Southern Methodist University has some interesting people, Omer.
Yes, indeed. I mean, we have great faculty. It's a very nice place to be. I think our students like it a lot also. So we have people like Klaus Desmet, who's
Yes, I want him
uh,
on the show.
yes. You had him already,
No,
or
I
you want
want
to?
him. I want him on the show.
You should definitely have him. Klaus is a very interesting and very nice person to have. So that's you. I'm sure he will say yes.
All right then. So you can talk to Claude whenever I want someone on the show and I'm unable to get them. I just tell their colleague to put in a good word for me, and then he appears.
No, of course, I will. That's for sure.
Yeah. So Omar, there's a paper you produced some years ago titled "Distance to the Pre-Industrial Technological Frontier and Economic Development." Firstly, Omar, what is the technological frontier?
Well, in that paper, in general, I mean, the idea of the technological frontier is basically the location where you have the most advanced technology in the world, right? I mean, depending on the literature you're looking at, some people will define this more clearly, like as a geographical location, right? Or you will have the idea of the technological frontier, just like the whole knowledge that's gathered in different technologies, like what's the most advanced technology available in the world, right? And so for this paper, basically what I'm doing is trying to think about it really in terms of where these places are located and try to follow how being close or far away from those places that are very technologically advanced can have an impact on your development.
All right, Umar. And where was the technological frontier in the pre-industrial era?
Well, in the pre-industrial era, it's been like in different places. So in the paper, for example, I'm exploiting data from around the year 1 CE on the contemporary era. And so like I there basically work with two technological frontiers for the old world, or let's say Eurasia and Africa. And so there I'm locating it basically, or like historians kind of agree that it tends to be located in the Eastern Mediterranean and also in China, right? And then in general, we have movements of the location of the technological frontier, especially the Western technological frontier that moves, let's say, from the Eastern Mediterranean towards like Italy, and then later to Holland, and then to the UK, right? And nowadays, we tend to think about the technological frontier to be located in the US.
Umar, why would distance away from the technological frontier in the pre-industrial era be associated with higher levels of innovation in the contemporary era?
Well, the point I'm trying to make in the paper is kind of, I mean, when I tell this story, I try to explain it like if you're think about like when you're sitting in class, when you were a child in, let's say, elementary school or so, right? Usually there's someone who's the person who understands everything perfectly, knows everything, is studying. And so if you're close to that person, it's easy to copy from that person, right? And so if you think about countries, if you're closely located to the technological frontier, you have the advantage that you can just bring in all the new technology, all the gadgets, all the knowledge, right? As you move further away, and that's kind of where we've been focusing on how the distance to the technological frontier affects development nowadays, we tend to think that the further away you are, the less you can have these benefits of technology spill over into you, like you being able to copy, to import those technologies. Now, the difference is that during the pre-industrial era, first, technologies were really not embedded in goods. It's usually knowledge embedded in people, right? And so what I argue is that the further away you are from the technological frontier, well, the less you can copy and the more you have to first force yourself to innovate, right, your own technologies. But also, even if you're able to bring something from the technological frontier, that usually you will need to tinker more to make it work in your own environment, right? And so there's a lot of evidence that moving technologies across space, especially in the pre-industrial era, made it very difficult to really make those technologies work in different places, right? And so there are examples, for example, with cathedral construction within Europe and things like that, where even things that you would think are very made by blueprint, where you know exactly how things should be done, the fact that you're doing it at a different place where you have different climate, different soils, may prevent you from basically replicating the technology in other places. And so what I argue is that somehow being far away creates this kind of incentive for you to innovate on your own, to tinker and toil with basically any innovation that you've heard of or that you've seen working somewhere else to make it work in your own environment, right? And this will create kind of a culture and perhaps even institutions that may be beneficial for innovation later on, right? And so basically what I do in the paper is kind of show that indeed you have this kind of inverse U-shaped relationship between the distance from the frontier and technological development, right? And I try to provide evidence that the more time you've been kind of far away from the technological frontier, the more time you've been exposed to these incentives to create a culture of innovation. And then in the end, you actually have more innovation in the contemporary era as measured by patents and other things.
Omer, I like your explanation, but I'm going to give you some homework. Post 1500, the Western world surged ahead of countries in Asia, including Japan, India, and China, the original economic superpowers, especially India and China. During 1500 to 1900 and even in the 1950s, many of these countries were still laggards compared to the West, yet they were located far away from the technological frontier. So why were these countries not motivated to innovate at a higher level? Is it because of their culture? So for example, cultural traits like individualism versus collectivism and autonomy versus conformity? This is your homework.
No, careful. I mean, careful that what I'm saying is it's all relative, right? So indeed, China and Japan may have been less developed than the technological frontier, right? But what I'm saying is that if you're sufficiently far away, you will be better off than countries in between, right? And so indeed, some of these countries may be poorer than the technological frontier, but they will be richer than countries that are perhaps somewhere in between in those distances, right? So if you look at Central Asia, which is kind of in between, let's say, China and the UK, will be much poorer than China, right? Similarly for Japan, or if you look at other regions, for example, in the world where you have like, if you look towards the south of Africa, etc., right? And so in a sense, it's not really an absolute thing where being far away will make you richer than the technological frontier, but it will make you better off than people that are somewhere in between, right? And so again, if you think about this comparison, what I was saying, like if you're sitting in a classroom, you have the person that knows, let's say, how to do math in class. If you're sitting next to them, you can always copy in the exam and things will go well for you, right? If you're sitting a little further away, you may be able to copy a little less and you will be worse and worse. But if you're really far away, you don't have the option of copying, right? So you have to do the homework. And then even though perhaps you're not as good with math, or perhaps you're not doing as much homework as you should, perhaps you still may be better at doing the exam than the person who's somewhere in between, who doesn't have the incentive to learn on their own, but also is not benefiting from copying from the person that actually has done the homework and knows everything, right?
All right, I get your arguments clearly, Omer. At no point did I not sufficiently understand what you're arguing. When scholars on this show, I just like to tease them and give them some.
No, it's okay. I just
yes,
yeah. That's perfectly fine. That's okay.
because another puzzle in economic history is why the countries like India and China regress for so long relative to the West, when they were not short of human capital or resources.
And not only that, they're actually the original places of a lot of technologies, right, that we use, right? And that's kind of the big questions that we have. And I think that, again, I don't think for example, my paper can give you a very strong understanding of why they end up lagging afterwards, right? I think that there are so many other forces that are also affecting comparative development in the last 500 years that we cannot really be expecting a unique causal explanation, right? And then so in that sense, for example, in the paper, I take China usually as kind of a frontier in the eastern frontier where countries could in principle have copied, right? Or if you use India, you can get something similar. But I cannot explain first how those countries become the frontiers, right? And if you think about kind of a generalization of the model, and that's related to other work that I did during my PhD, you can, and it's related to work that I've been doing with Oded Galor, is that, and with Kamrul Ashraf, is that somehow, if you take the full, the extension of this model, in a sense, you would think that being isolated may actually be very good for you in the long run, right? You basically benefit from not being exposed to a lot of things, right, that may be bad, right? For example, plagues, right, which now we kind of understand that being isolated may be good to prevent you from dying from someone else's diseases. But it also creates really the incentives for you to create these cultures of innovation that may be beneficial, right? And so, of course, if you're very central, you may benefit from diffusion of technologies from other places, etc. But you also have this kind of negative outcomes that come from being also very centrally located, right? And so if you think that your places are very centrally located, you will have armies that may be marching by, destroying all your capital, killing your people, destroying human capital, etc. And so you kind of have different forces that may affect how isolation may play a role in the long run. And so while in the paper, I didn't really work on what explains why some places become the frontier or stop being the frontier, I think we kind of get a sense of how this may have an impact. But I think that for the big question of, let's say, why the West overcame and passed the East, in a sense, in the last 1,000 years, right? If you think of it, let's say, by the year 1000, basically, England is much poorer than, let's say, the Ottoman, like the precursors of the Ottoman Empire, right? All these Muslim kingdoms in the Middle East, it's much poorer than perhaps parts of India, parts of China, but it's really in the last 500, 600 years that you have this explosive uptick in economic development in Northwestern Europe that really is quite extraordinary, right?
All right, Omer. And in your article, you made reference to examples of innovations that were spurred because these countries were located away from the frontier. Many of these innovations were in Asian countries. So, for example, you listed Nepal.
Yeah. Okay. So that's kind of examples that I'm giving for contemporary technologies that are being innovated or improved on in places that are not, let's say, the usual OECD or like the US, Japan, UK, and certain parts of Europe, right? And so there I give an example of, for example, surgeries for cataracts. And so in Nepal, you really have a high prevalence of cataract because of the elevation of the country. And if you think about, like, first of all, in places like Europe and the US, you have less of a prevalence and you have less incentives to try to innovate these type of technologies. And so one of the doctors that now is like a global leader in this, but he created was a way of doing a procedure that's like, it costs, I think, like $1 or something like this. It's really cheap. And it takes less than 15 minutes. And he basically is now doing mass campaigns of operating people's cataracts and with this. And this basically comes from him approaching the problem in a way that's different because of the institutional framework and the cultural framework that you have in Nepal, right? I give other examples that have to do, for example, with medical tech. Like, say, if you think about like X-ray technology, etc., that we usually have to go to hospitals to have those taken. You have these huge machines that cost millions of dollars, perhaps. Again, what we saw is that, for example, in the case of, I think it was General Electric, when they tried to sell these technologies, let's say, for example, in India, the culture is different, the budgets are so much different that it's really became a problem to sell it over there. But their labs in those regions, basically what they did was miniaturize all these technologies so that actually doctors could continue doing what they used to do, right? So doctors usually would go to the small towns in different places in the rural area and visit people, check on them and see how they're doing. Right now, we have miniaturized technology in those places basically to be able to allow these doctors to continue providing these services. And now what we've seen is that basically now this technology has kind of been imported back to the developed countries. Now we go to our doctors here in the US and you have kind of similar technologies where you can do an X-ray, you can do an echography in a portable way with basically a laptop and a very small machine, right? And all of these things kind of like have been innovated in places that don't fit, let's say, institutionally or culturally, what's happening in the developing countries, right? Or let's say in the technological frontier.
Omer, could it be that countries in Asia have a longer duration of institutional complexity and human capital formation? And because most people are often skeptical of innovations, Western countries that were fragmented for a long time, they often wage wars, and then we had the Enlightenment, and the Enlightenment in a sense facilitated the flow of ideas. Hence, in these countries, people are more receptive to innovation, whereas in places like Japan and China, and India, these are Asian civilizations. They're confident in themselves. And as I said earlier, most people tend to be skeptical of innovation. So could this be a reason why they lagged behind the West for so long?
It could be. I mean, I know that that's kind of a very wide-led belief, right? In the sense that somehow Europe, especially the fact that it had this history of fractionalization, which created kind of like a market for ideas and competition among states, made them more open to innovation and to accept innovation, right? While we tend to believe that non-European societies tend to be less willing to adopt technologies, right? But I think it has to do sometimes more with what incentives you have to adopt certain things, right? So again, you may not know how useful those technologies are to be willing to adopt them or not, right? I think, like, for example, if you look at military technologies, for example, right, where like the benefit tends to be clear, right? You see that military technologies tend to be adopted very easily, no matter where they were created, right? So
Exactly.
if you think about, for example, the Shogun era Japan and at the end, right? And so you have like the movie of, what is it, The Last Samurai or something, right? Where you basically have mechanization and import of all these European military technologies perfectly adopted very easily. Same thing if you think about Native Americans, right? They adopted again weapons that were European weapons without any props, right? They clearly could see the benefits of these technologies and they adopted them. It's not clear to me that there's really always like that there are really these cultural things that we believe may make one culture less willing to adopt than others, right? We do see in the data that in general, certain places tend to be slower to adopt, but I think there are so many, there are so many confounding issues that I'm not 100% sure we have fully resolved whether it is indeed culture or what cultural aspects fully determines if you're willing or not to adopt certain technologies. We do know that, for example, institutional setups matter, right? And so institutions and cultures which tend to be very hierarchical tend to be very bad for innovation, right? And for adoption of technology, basically because you tend to be very conservative. You don't want any changes that may destroy the structures of power, right? But I think there's still a lot of research to be done, especially I think we need more data and analysis from places that are not the typical, let's say, Europe, China, and Japan, right? We need more research in other regions to
like Africa.
Africa, especially. I keep telling, and that's one of the problems we have. Let's say we have this huge hole in economic history with what has to do with Africa, Central Asia, South America, right? Or Latin America in general. We tend to have very strong held beliefs about a lot of the things that we know about economic development, but this is really based on very few countries and data for very specific periods in very specific countries, right? And so a lot of what we know is driven basically from data from the UK, Holland, of course, China, I guess Japan a little bit. But let's say we do have vast past parts of the world where basically we know very little, and perhaps we need to study more these other regions of the world to get a more clear and more full picture, which in the end is what's been happening in the last 10, 15 years, right? What we see is really this explosion of people working with colonial data in Africa, for example, to get a better sense of what was happening, et cetera. And so there's like a lot of very interesting and exciting research being done at the moment that tries to basically plug these holes that we have in our knowledge, right?
Yeah, Jared Rubin was on the show some time ago, and his research has shed relevant light on the political economy of technological adoption. Countries were more likely to adopt military technologies because they did not pose a risk to the hegemony of religious elites. Even in the Asante Empire and in Ethiopia, people were inclined to adopting military technologies.
Mm-hmm. Exactly, right. And this brings again what I'm saying. I mean, it's all about incentives, and incentives can be economical, can be political. I mean, there are many reasons why you may or not be willing to adopt technologies. And again, it may depend on the type of technology that you may be adopting, right? You think about, again, the expansion of crops in the Colombian exchange, right? We do know that, for example, Europeans, many of the things that they found in the Americas, they thought they were strange, didn't taste good, but nowadays are basically staples of the cuisine of many countries, right? And especially if you think about the potato, it's really amazing how it was adopted in a way that basically you would not believe that they didn't have it as part of their shared culture 500 years ago, right? And so again, and this has to do with the incentives that you get, because you may get a crop that's better for you in terms of calories, maybe better for you because it may be more resistant to like plagues for the crop or like to climatic change. It may be better suited for, let's say, the type of land distribution that you may have, et cetera, right? And so I think it's all about incentives. And in that sense, I think like, again, it may be the political economy of those incentives. It may be just the pure economic benefits that you may get or not from those innovations. Of course, again, usually culture and institutions will play a role in this. Geography will play a role in this, right?
Omar, let us not fool ourselves. People, irrespective of culture, are skeptical of innovation. Yes, according to the data, Western cultures are more innovative than non-Western cultures, but irrespective of cultures, people are skeptical of innovators. But because Western culture is a bit more receptive to innovation and some eccentric ideas, they are likely to innovate on a more radical level. Let me give a perfect example that's not directly related to innovation. Gender equality and gay marriage can be correlates of innovation because they serve as a proxy for openness. So
Yes.
countries that tolerate gay marriage and are supportive of gender equality are not richer because of gay marriage, but the consequence of the consequence of supporting gay marriage indicates that you're more accepting of unusual ideas.
Indeed. Yeah. I mean, this is just like a proxy. I mean, in the end, it will reflect your openness in socially, let's say, which may be correlated with your openness to ideas, etc. Right? But again, I mean, I still believe that, of course, your cultures will affect and your experiences will affect. But let's say if you take, I mean, we have this really strong, and again, this is what I think, like we need more data. We have this very strong beliefs about, let's say, Western people growing up in Western countries to be more open to ideas, right? I think that we can always find examples that would say the opposite, right? For example, and again, this just shows that we, in a sense, we always are very conservative. We like to keep within the things that make us sure that we know what to expect, that we know that it will not kill us, etc. Right? So think about, for example, if you were to ask anyone about tourists going to their country, right? You will see that most people will identify certain countries as more willing or less willing to try local foods, right? Which again, I mean, if you think about it, this kind of makes sense, right? If I go to another country, I don't know anything, but I see a Starbucks, I see a McDonald's, those are things I identify, I know, and then I can go and get food there. Or I can risk and spend my money eating something that I have no idea if I will like, etc. Right? And so in a sense, adoption of innovation, I think, is very similar in this sense, right? You can always think about it that you always have this security of knowing how things work with what you have, right? But then if you find something new, unless there is clearly benefits that you can identify somehow because you see someone else benefiting from it, or because perhaps there's nothing to lose, right? Let's say if what you have right now basically brings you no major benefits, then you may be more willing to innovate. But of course, it's all about this uncertainty, right? I agree that there are certain cultural traits, but these things change to the time, right? I mean, you may think, for example, it's certain religions that are more or less open to innovation and to accept others' ideas, but you see that this has changed dramatically again in the last 1,000 years, for example, right? And so if you were to take a time machine, go back in time and ask people which religion do you think is the more open to innovation and new ideas, etc., I'm sure that you would find the ranking to be very different from what you would find today if you did the same survey, right? And so I think we need to just be careful about like what exactly in these different aspects may be driving the results, right?
Openness is an ambiguous concept. So Westerners may see that they're open to new ideas and freedom and liberalism, but are they open to the idea of polygamous marriages? Many of them are not. So
that's why, exactly, right? I mean, and again, it depends on what we're talking about, depends on how we think that these are interacting in a way, right? And so, yes, I completely agree. Some of these concepts are so wide that sometimes you don't know exactly. We have a sense of what we think that we're talking about, but that may not be the case, right?
it's just like property rights. Property rights are associated with economic growth, but depending on how property rights are managed in developing countries, they can either be a benefit or impede growth. Peter Leeson, he has an excellent paper on the topic, on detailing the administration of property rights in Kenya and why it failed to induce growth.
Indeed, right? Again, I mean, think about property rights. I think that someone raised this issue recently on Twitter, and I thought that they were making a very nice point, right? So a lot of, for example, when we talk about the US and development in the US, we tend to talk about property rights being one of the main drivers of US economic development, right? But this was really property rights for white colonists, let's say, but it really was against the property rights of native people, right? For example, right? And so again, if you look at the history of the US, right, you see that the property rights of certain groups were basically taken away, and the property was basically taken away to give it to other groups, right? And then once you have that, and I have a similar experience if I look back at the history of Colombia, people tend to kind of move others out of land, for example, and take advantage of their force and political power and economic power. And then once they have moved the original owners of the land away, basically then they really want to enforce property rights, right? And so this may create, for example, inequality that then with very strong property rights may just create very bad economic results, because you create bad incentives. You have big landowners that benefit from having a population that perhaps is not investing in human capital. You don't have investment in public schooling, etc. Right?
And on the flip side, years ago, John Coatesworth produced a groundbreaking paper on Latin America income inequality and property rights, and his argument is quite compelling, interesting, and for some even outrageous. I would love to have him on the show. He's basically contending that the fact that Europeans were able to appropriate property in the developing world created growth inducing mechanisms because they had higher levels of human capital. Are you familiar with that paper?
No, I'm not familiar with that paper. Actually, I would like to see it. That would be super interesting.
Yeah, John quotes
It, it,
for it.
it almost sounds like Marx's initial what is that Marx calls it, like the initial accumulation of the original accumulation
Or
of capital,
yes.
right, something like this. It sounds a little bit like this. The difference is I guess that he means creating development in the periphery where you're actually arriving more than in the center through expropriation, I guess, right?
And Umar, I'm in favor of property rights, but can rights violating property rights be growth enhancing? The answer is yes. Look at the enclosure movement, for example. That entailed a violation of property rights. But
Yeah, think about South Korea, right? South Korea has something similar, right? The movement to industrialization in the 60s is about, again, expropriation and reallocation of ownership, reallocation of the wealth into a different sector, et cetera, right? And so, yes, I mean, that's why I guess, as usual, nothing seems to be absolute, right? Nothing is always good or always bad. It really depends on how things are applied and right? I mean, you can imagine expropriating can be great depending on how you're expropriating, who you're expropriating, and what you're doing with that expropriation. Or it could be terrible if it ends up creating a political elite, perhaps, that will own the whole land and has no incentives for development, right?
It's just like the case study of privatization. Multinational corporations transplant new technologies and knowledge to developing countries. Some multinational corporations conduct themselves at a high level and others do not. So it's always a catch 22.
Yeah, and plus, I mean, in the end, a lot of technology is not easily transferable, even if the multinational comes to your country, right? I mean, you may just be basically building up, like putting together the chips for an iPhone. There's very little technological transfer in that case, right? Or if you're just in one of the maquilas, let's say south of the border here in Texas, you may just be putting together some of the goods that you will be exporting, but you're not gaining any knowledge and not really transferring any technology, right?
But on average, multinational corporations are likely to be good corporate citizens. This is what the evidence I have surveyed has shown.
Well, I mean, yeah, but again, yeah, that can be the case. Depends on what you're exactly looking at. I'm not sure.
Umar, do you know what's also quite fascinating? The concept of the resource curse. So this is replete in the economic literature. We're often talking about the resource curse, but other academics are arguing that the resource curse is contingent on institutional quality. So countries with better institutions are able to exploit their resources because high quality institutions in a sense vitiate the resource curse. And I'm more likely to side with the latter argument that institutions can negate the resource curse because look at Nigeria, for example. Nigeria is resource rich. Its economy is growing, but it is also facing a number of economic challenges due to institutional efficiencies. And I actually interviewed someone from Nigeria who was able to provide direct insight. So maybe the issue is not resources, but the quality of institutions.
I completely agree. I mean, take Norway, right? I mean, again, compare Norway to Saudi Arabia or to Venezuela, right? Again, these are oil-rich countries, but the outcomes of that wealth basically is completely different, right? And so, yes, I completely think that institutions will play a huge role, right?
So are you from Turkey?
I'm half Turkish, half Colombian.
Okay. Did you live in Turkey at any point in time?
Yes, when I was very little.
Okay. Oh, when you were very little, so not as an adult. So you can't comment much on your childhood in Turkey then.
No, I mean, like, besides telling you that I had a great time, enjoyed the people and the food, and the family was great, it's hard for me to tell you about the day-to-day life. I mean,
But Omar, Turkey is actually one of the countries which are really rich institutional history.
yes, of course. I mean, and like institutional, cultural, right? It's in the crossroads of Eurasia, right? And so, indeed, right? I mean, you have a very, very rich history that goes back thousands of years, right?
But Turkey, uh, um, one economist in her research, she listed Turkey as one of the countries with a history of irrigation, and irrigation is positively correlated with autocracy, and autocracy is a negative predictor of growth. And today, Turkey is being led by someone who can be described as an autocrat. So maybe one of the impediments of Turkish growth is deep roots of development in irrigation.
It could be, yes. But again, I mean, if you look at the last 50 years, part of it, I mean, US has been trying to join, for example, Europe, right, for over 50 years now, I guess. And it has had a lot of institutional changes. It's very integrated economically with Europe. But let's say what you find is that, again, these differences in religion, which we take as differences in culture, really prevent Turkey from having any chance of entering the European Union, right? And so, in a sense, part of what we, and this is one of those strange things, right? When Erdogan came into power, it was seen as a great outcome of the democratization of Turkey, right? In a sense that you have like a religious party, which tended to be forbidden, now in power, showing that in a sense, Turkey has become more open, more democratic. And what we see is that once these groups come into power, what they have done is basically like limit, in a sense, and cut the legs a little bit of democracy. I mean, and so, yes, it could be that it is irrigation, and somehow we tend to go back to autocracies in Turkey because of some cultural and institutional aspects going back to irrigation. But I think that there are like perhaps much more recent shocks that have had a huge impact on this, right?
Omar,
Yes.
when we're discussing institutions, why don't we define their cognitive rules? In one place, institutions may be created to enable change. In another place, institutions are created to manage change. So how can we say that an institution is failing when it is implementing its own goals?
Well, I guess what you're telling me is that in a sense we need to define what institutions we're talking about, right?
Exactly. So
Yeah.
for instance, yesterday I interviewed a scholar who's interested in Chinese history. He did a paper on China, and his research comports with the broader data, contending that cultural change in China is often managed by the state. So how can we say that Chinese institutions are hampering innovation when they were actually created to manage change to prevent disruption?
Well, I mean, I mean, if it's true that they were created to manage change, right? Again, depends on what you want to do with that change, right? If it serves the state, if it serves the people in power, then of course you will allow that innovation to happen. And then in that sense, if you see it like this, then you would say like, okay, great, these institutions are actually good for innovation, right? If it's on the other hand hampering some innovation because they see it as bad for the state, then you would argue that they're bad, right? But again, even here, again, it's not even clear what we mean by Chinese institutions. I'm sure that there must be different aspects that we may be thinking about, right?
Exactly. So we have to define institutions properly before we can judge them.
I completely agree, right? And if you, I mean, and this goes back to a lot of the issues that I feel like we are working very hard to improve, right? I mean, we tended to, like, say, perhaps 30 years ago, talk about institutions kind of being captured by certain aspects in our regressions or certain aspects in our models. And we're kind of every time, especially in the empirical part, I think, trying to disentangle different aspects, right? So we used to talk about institutions, perhaps we used one measure, which may have been, I don't know, one of the measures of the World Bank on
expropriation.
Yes, or you like the constraints on the constitutional constraints on the executive, things like that, right? Which are proxies for something that we think has to do with good institutions, but we may not have been trying. We were not clarifying which aspects, right? But what we see in the last 20 years, I think, is like ever more work trying to disentangle. Is it property rights, or is it really about having markets that work? Is it about access to finance? Is it about, right, different aspects of those institutions that we think may matter for growth, and we're trying to identify the different effects, right?
And again, property rights is the most germane case study. What do we actually mean when we talk about property rights? Property rights indicates that property ought to be inalienable. We should own it. We should own our property. We have the right to trade it freely. It belongs to us, and it should never be violated by third parties. But let's look at patent law. Patent law is created.
In that definition that you just gave, you introduced, in a sense, the existence of markets for property rights to exist, right?
Yes.
Or not? Or what? Because I wasn't sure, because property can exist even without the markets, right? If, as long as I can give you my laptop and no one will say, like, no, wait a minute, you cannot give it to Lipton because it actually belongs to me, right? Or because things are not well defined there. Even without markets, we can have property rights.
We can have property rights without markets, but some property rights created by the legislative process can also halt the creation of other property rights. So a patent law is actually entailing a monopoly right.
Yeah. It's basically the commodification of a lot of things, right? I mean, if you think about, again, think about what has happened in the last 20 years, for example, in the software industry, right? Now we can patent things that were not patentable a couple of decades ago, right? And especially math used to be non-patentable, right? And so imagine that, but now algorithms, which in the end is just math, are being patented, right? And so we're creating commodities for things that used not to be commodities, right? So you're right, indeed.
And property rights preclude you from invading my property. That's why they exist. So even though Omer had the right to move freely around, that right is blocked when he decides to violate my property. So property right has to be carefully assessed. We get the stereotypical definition of what property rights implied, but when you look at the concept more broadly, there are many examples of property rights creating monopolistic rights.
Yes, and I think, I mean, just this week I was tweeting about a paper by Petra Moser and
yes,
her co-author's name. I'm so bad with names. I'm sorry. And they had this beautiful paper. I think that's one of the nicest papers, right? Looking at how violation of copyrights allow more innovation to happen.
Right? Is this a new, hold on, Omer, is this a recent paper? Because I know Petra has several pieces on
it just came out in AJ. I just remember it was in the AJ that I didn't expect that paper to be there. I think it was in the microeconomics, and which I thought it perhaps should have been in the applied or in the, I think it was in AJ and microeconomics, the current issue. And so what they find is basically, and it's this idea that somehow the fact that copyrights exist prevent me from creating innovation, right? And if you think about the type of models that we create for innovation, we usually have very clear the aspect of the monopoly rents, right? But we tend to either not take into account or is somehow put under the rug the cost of actually being able to innovate, given that I need other technologies to be able to innovate, right? And that's really what, in a sense, this paper is showing us, that if these costs can be so big that really they hinder innovation, right? And you kind of always have this, we usually talk about this problem of socially, let's say, exposed. Eliminating copyright or patents would be great. Ex ante, we need them because we need to create the incentives to innovate, right? And so let me think who it is. It's Fudenberg, Drew Fudenberg, I think, and Michele Boldrin. They have like
Yes,
a couple of papers, right, where they're trying to look at innovation in a sense where you don't have these monopolistic rights. And I think this brings back kind of like this whole discussion of how can we create innovation without having the downside of long patents and monopoly power for a long time, right?
We can always propose a solution. My solution is not original, it's influenced by other researchers. Private foundations and research organizations can provide a pool of funding to stimulate innovation and further research. In other words, we reward innovators.
Indeed, right? I mean, again, you could buy those patents and make them open, right? For example, think about the innovation that allowed people to figure out longitudes, right? There was basically a prize that said you will get, I can't remember, £1 million if you figure out how to solve this problem, right? And so there are other ways to solve this that perhaps will overcome the downsides of patents, for example, right? The problem is that, of course, patents.
Sorry? We don't even need to abolish patents. What is required is greater flexibility. Someone creates a product, gets a patent, and he may license the patent to several different players, and these players must be able to incorporate their own existing innovations or incremental processes. So we don't even need to get rid of patents.
No, of course. But the problem here is that you have incentives to prevent others of using, right? If you look again, the patenting, for example, of the steam engine, right? Basically, with 50 years when that patent was active, all the research was either halted or was basically in violation of patenting law, and then you had other types of trouble, right? And if you hold the patent for something, you may have a huge amount of monopoly profits that you'd want to keep for yourself, and you want to somehow guard, and which that's why, I mean, if you think about it, we've seen patent law seems to be covering more things longer, right? I mean, we're patenting genes, right? I mean, genes that we have not really identified, but I mean, we didn't create, but somehow just identified, right? And so someone could come in here, in a sense, take something that's been available for millennia, and then just the fact that you are the first to somehow identify the genome, then you can end up patenting something like this, right? In principle, that's something that is starting to happen, and that's something that I know that, for example, poor countries and richer countries are fighting over, right? You have all these problems with environmental diversity, ecological diversity, that somehow is starting to be patented in places that have no even a history of the place, right? And again, even if you think about like more deeply, I mean, we're patenting things that's not clear we should be allowed to patent, right?
Innovation can occur without patents, and there are numerous examples to justify this point. Joel Mokyr has an entire paper on the topic, but patents have become necessary in the contemporary era because they signal innovation and productivity. So for instance, some years ago, a study noted that companies with patents are more likely to grow. And this is unsurprising because patents enable a company to leverage institutional funding.
Yes, indeed. I mean, no one's saying that that's not going to be the case. I mean, the question is if that's the best, socially, it's the best thing that can happen or not, or we can basically improve on what we have. The patent system has been very good at allowing innovation, but we know that also a lot of innovation happens independent of patenting, right? If you look at, for example, the open source movement, right? There's a lot of innovation happening there. A lot of the things that you use for your cell phone, for example, right, are based on open source. So a lot of innovation that has happened. MP3s, I think, are methods that are open source, right? I mean, we do know that patents are useful. I guess it also depends on the fixed cost of getting the innovation, right? And that's kind of our main issue, right? I haven't checked the numbers. I mean, how much did we have to spend to get the current vaccines, for example, for COVID, right? And again, you saw the discussion immediately about if we should have bought the patents and basically open it up for the rest of the world, right? Again, you have the social benefit aspect exposed.
Since we're on the topic of patents and barriers to the flow of innovation, Omer, I don't know if you have been noticing it, but we're still yet to achieve the global integration of capital. Some investment apps are available in America, but they're not available elsewhere. Some American investment companies allow foreigners to use their platform to purchase stocks. Other companies do not. So we're still yet to attain the global integration of capital.
Yes, indeed. I mean, and that's one thing that I've been discussing. For example, if you look at the 401k system in the US and in Colombia and in Chile and other countries, we have something similar. The fact that you don't allow, for example, Colombian workers to diversify and invest outside Colombia is penalizing those worker savings amazingly. It's just really the difference in returns between what you can get in the 401k in the US versus, let's say, the equivalent in Colombia is like an order of magnitude different.
What are you saying, Omer, that Colombian workers cannot invest in foreign instruments?
No, they cannot. I mean, so
why? Why?
You cannot invest the part. I mean, perhaps you may be able to invest, as you're saying. Like I go on internet and I use my credit card to buy stocks from Apple, but I cannot use the money that I have to put into my pension system to actually invest in, let's say, a mutual fund that's in the US.
Yes, that's objectionable, and I do have a problem with governments disallowing individuals from using their pension systems freely. So if I want to invest $1 million or $2 million in my pension account, that should be my business. I have a problem with limiting pension accounts.
No, of course, but I mean, we all kind of understand where this comes from, right? I mean, in a sense, if you look at the what, let's say, especially Latin American countries were told in the 90s, the idea was to go from this pay-as-you-go system to fully funded systems. The idea was to really strengthen local capital markets, right? And so in a sense, the idea was to create all these savings that then would be there, that would boost investment in the country, and that would also allow FDI to come in and take advantage of all the potential that these countries have, right? Especially because we know that since they have less capital, they should also have higher returns to capital, right? But in the end, we haven't seen those things materialize, which brings us back perhaps to the whole institutional problem with capture of rents, et cetera, right? And so if in the case of Colombia, for example, basically you have one or two groups or families owning basically most of the financial system. And what you end up having because of this law that prevents you from investing overseas is a subsidizing system where the richest families are being subsidized with the savings of the poorer ones, right?
And Omer, I also have a problem with legislators in the US who are criticizing Peter Thiel for his IRA account. Peter Thiel is evidence that the system can work provided that you are smart. I'm a libertarian, Omer, so I'm not particularly interested in equality.
I imagine since you're part of the Mises Institute, so.
Yes, I am a libertarian. So I'm not fascinated by the concept of equality, and my views are to the right of many on the mainstream, but we're not going to talk about philosophy today. But yes, Peter Thiel's success is evidence that the system can work provided that you use your intelligence.
Yeah, I think that's too long a debate to
Yes.
have right now. I think again, this comes under the idea that somehow your background doesn't matter, right? In a sense that this goes back to kind of like it's a strong held belief, especially I see among certain people in the US here, that somehow if you want it, you can get it, right? There's nothing constraining you. And I at least I'm on the other side of your case. I'm further to the left, right? So I really do not believe that somehow it's just enough to be smart. I think you have to be smart and lucky.
Yes,
And
you have to be smart and lucky. Social capital is important. The average entrepreneur is the son of upper middle class person.
so that's why. I mean, but even that, I mean, nowadays, especially in the US, even accessing good education is something that not everyone can have, right? So in a sense, you really when you're saying that the system works and then you only need to be smart enough, I think that's putting under the rug a lot of other inequalities and constraints to what you're saying, right? I mean, in principle, it should be true if we start from a level field, I guess. But I'm not convinced.
But reforming the IRA system is only making it more difficult for ordinary people to create wealth. That's another barrier.
In which sense or why? What's the proposal for that?
No, so so Peter Thiel has 5 billion in his IRA account because he purchased shares in PayPal. So legislators in the United States want to prevent a repeat of Peter Thiel. They're going to create more laws to cap what can be invested in the IRA to prevent billionaires from becoming even richer. And I'm saying that the average person will not become as wealthy as Peter Thiel. He doesn't even need to become as wealthy as Peter Thiel, but the government should create strategies to enable wealth creation.
But is that, I mean, are those numbers true? Because I mean, in a sense, I think you cannot invest more than $5,000 a year, right? And so if you to go from 5,000 to whatever, even 5 million, that's 1,000 times.
Yeah, it's rare. Exactly my point. Most people will not be as wealthy as Peter Thiel. So you don't need to use the Peter Thiel example as a policy failure. Allow the system to pick winners and losers.
But again, I mean, this is not the system. I mean, in the end, it's the person that's picking losers and winners, right? Of course, again, we also have laws that prevent me from, for example, participating in an IPO, I think, right?
Why would you be barred from participating?
I think there are laws that prevent like ordinary investors that have
yes.
too little money to be investing. Basically, because you know that sometimes people, I mean, if you're not a sophisticated investor, people can take advantage of you. Right?
Accredited investors, I get what you're talking about.
Right. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, again, I think that for most people, the strategy should just be using mutual funds and then let index funds just follow the market, and that's it, right? But yeah, I'm still like I still cannot believe the numbers that you were telling me, and I cannot believe that the discussion is about it.
Peter Thiel was able to make billions because PayPal is really successful. That's why it moved from less than $2,000 to several billions, because of his PayPal shares.
Yeah, but that may be his wealth, but I cannot believe it has to do with his IRA account, right? Again, because it's so limited what you can invest. For example, one of the things that should be changed, I guess, is allowing people to, especially people who don't have a 401k or a 403b account, to invest more in their IRA, right? Most people, I mean, if you don't have a job that has its own pension plan, in a sense, right? If you're an entrepreneur, if you're self-employed, the only way to save for retirement tax-free is the IRA, and you have very low limits, right? And so I think and even though you have some credits to kind of help like the lower income households, I think what you need is to actually increase the amount that people can put in the IRA, right? I mean, self-employed people basically are getting like the short end of the stick, right? They cannot really invest into their pension for the future. At least they cannot do it in a tax-free way that people who actually work with a company that has a 401k plan can do. Right?
Omer, do you know what I want? I want to globalize immigration. I'm introducing the concept of a non-resident citizen. As a non-resident citizen, you should not be allowed to accept American welfare or health benefits, but all the productive privileges that are available to American citizens, like the 401k and the IRA accounts, should be available to me. I want to exploit the US financial system. I know it sounds crazy, but it's something that I've been thinking about a lot.
Well, I mean, I actually, yesterday, I can't remember what piece of news I was reading, but it made me think a little bit about this. I mean, again, I think it was about climate change. And one of the things that perhaps we really need to do is, I mean, is open borders. That's for sure, right? We need to allow people to go wherever they want, be able to work wherever they want, and contribute to society wherever they want. I completely agree with that, right? Now, if you're having me pay taxes here, I think that I should, I mean, again, this comes to the question of why you pay taxes, right? And if I'm paying taxes, I do expect to receive something in return. So if your proposal is let them come, let them not pay into Social Security, but also not get benefits of Social Security, then I think that's
my proposal is really for people like myself who are business oriented. So I live in a country. I am not paying taxes in the US, therefore I should not be able to collect US health benefits or their social benefits. I'm a non-resident citizen. But as a non-resident citizen who is not allowed to live in the US or collect benefits, I must be able to use the US financial system without impediments.
Well, if you think that that's enough, I mean, so basically
that's what
you
I want. This is for business oriented.
What you want is basically to be somewhere overseas and be able to invest in the US.
Yes, without bureaucracy and make a lot of money. That's what I want.
Yeah, I mean, but that I mean, in a sense, the reason we cannot do it now a lot has to do with tax evasion, money laundering, all these other things, right? So I'm there with you if we solve those other problems first.
Well, as you said, Omer, I write for the Midas Institute, and one academic, he's a distinguished economist. I sent him a request to show up on the show, and he said, well, I like you. You sound interesting, but I don't like Midas.
Yeah, sadly, that's the case in general. I mean, I actually think, on the other hand, we need to be having these discussions, and right, and like even the philosophical ones, right? I think it is important. We need to understand, and this goes back to some of the discussions I've seen recently on Twitter about reading the classicals, right? I mean, I do think we need to read the classicals, because a lot of these ideas that were presented in the past that may not be technically explained, may not have any math, they still guide a lot of the work that we do today, or the questions that we do, and the political views we hold, right? And so I think we need, I mean, I actually saw that you were from the Middle East, and I thought, oh, this is very cool, because I mean, now we're talking about, I mean, I'm talking with people that politically I'm not aligned, even though methodologically sometimes I may, right? And so I think that's I mean, I think as academics, we need to be talking to everyone and discussing openly and finding each other's flaws in the arguments and be civil and nice and friendly. I really never understand the whole idea of I don't talk to you because you think differently than I do, right? I mean, I don't know if it has to do with my undergrad that was like basically we had Marxists, Keynesians, post-Keynesians, neo-Valrasians, etc. And so I was exposed to Hayek, Mises, Keynes, Marx, Smith, Ricardo, Kaleski, right, John Robinson, Hicks. And in the end, you just see that all of them were talking to each other and discussing each other's ideas. And I think that's what makes great economics, I think.
Yeah. So the essence of my brand of libertarianism is that the state is a racket, and as someone who
Is what? Sorry?
is a racket, the state is a racket, and as someone who subscribes to Christian theology, my other view is that the state is a necessary evil. So either way, I'm not in favor of the state. So back to your argument in relation to tax evasion, private law, private organizations can solve these issues. We can create more markets to fill the gap.
I guess, I mean, I have in my intermediate macro class, I have my students read 23 things they don't teach you about capitalism. And I think it's a very nice book. And
yes, that's by Untrue. How do you pronounce his name again?
I'm not gonna try.
Yeah.
And I think the first chapter especially, I think is so nice, so important, because it basically puts politics and economics in the whole creation of markets, right? And we tend to think like, first, I mean, we like a lot of, like, especially I think on the right, there's this kind of belief that markets are kind of magically there somehow. They're not created or sanctioned or anything like this. But I'm not sure we can solve everything with markets, right? And so in a sense, I mean, we could if we throw out all ethics and morals, I guess, right? And so let's say if people want to murder babies, in principle, yeah, we could create a market for this, and parents who want to sell their baby to be murdered could just charge enough money, right? And there could be an equilibrium and stuff like that.
Quick point.
Should we allow this? I mean, again, it's about, should we allow anything to become a commodity? Should we allow any market to exist? I guess that's part of the political problem, ethic and moral. And this is where, like, I think economics stops and we go into other areas.
Quick point, Omer. You cannot sell a baby. You're selling the guardianship rights to the baby.
Well, that's okay. As long as the guardianship rights include me, that I can do whatever I want with the baby, right? Including I can drown it or throw it out. Well,
actually, you wouldn't be able to drown the baby, because as the guardian of the baby, one has a duty of care to the baby.
But that's why you defined the commodity of the baby as basically the guardianship. But I'm defining it as the actual commodity owning the baby, right? And it's not like we don't see in history examples of ownership of other people, right? And so in a sense, again, this goes towards what you call, what's the commodity that you're allowing the market to exist, right? When you're saying that you will allow a market for guardianship, that's a very different market than the market that I was talking about, right?
Okay, I get your point clearly now. So you're talking about a market like slavery. We can sell people,
exactly, right?
And
again,
treat them how we deem fit. But
exactly.
Slavery is harsh. But even during slavery, there were some ameliorative reforms. But slavery is always harsh. So as the owner of a human being, do you have an incentive to exploit the product to the point where it becomes useless?
Yeah. I mean, I am not gonna try to find the optimal exploitation of slavery, especially, right? But I mean, notice in a sense that, again, this idea that somehow markets solve everything is not clear, right? And again, this takes us out of econ and makes us really talk about philosophy, politics, ethics, morals, and there may be markets that we should not allow to exist, right? I'm convinced that we should not have markets for people.
Most people would agree with that claim.
Right. And so in that sense, again, so notice that you and I may completely agree on this. Then it means that you're also not an absolutist in the sense that every market should exist and everyone there should be like free enterprise in any market. And we should be allowed to commodify anything, right? Again, for example, I think about prostitution. I'm all in favor of prostitution as long as the person selling the service wants and has other options, right? Again, this is one of those big problem. But again, so that requires you to solve certain issues that create, let's say, prostitution, where people are forcing kids into prostitution, or women are brought from different countries and basically enslaved into prostitution, right? So again, I guess it goes back to what we were saying about institutions, but we have to be very careful also when we talk about the market, what we mean, what's the commodity that you're talking about, right? The example with the baby kind of brought us back, right? I mean, you and I are talking about the market for babies. but we're talking about completely different markets and completely different commodities, right?
This is why the church in antiquity opposed prostitution, because prostitutes were usually subordinate to the buyer. Prostitution did not benefit women, and women, if they had other alternatives, they would not have been prostitutes. So as a result, the church stigmatized prostitution.
Is that the case? I actually don't know.
Yes.
Okay.
That's one of the reasons why prostitution became a stigma. But we're having an interesting discussion. I'm planning to wrap up, but before I wrap up, question: is culture a barrier to growth? This is in light of your paper, Cultural Diffusion and Economic Development, the Problem of Observational Equivalence. What's your main finding?
There we're trying to answer a different question more than like, not completely different in terms of. So there's this whole research agenda that Enrico Spolaore and Omer Ozak have created, right? Which I think is such a wonderful piece of scholarship, right? And a lot of the results basically, are showing that differences in development have to do with basically how much time different societies have been in contact to each other or not, right? Especially how much time they have been in contact with the technological frontier, right? And so in this paper, we're basically working on expanding some of the work. In the previous work, they had shown that this measure that is known as genetic distance, which basically it's a genetic clock that says how much time you and I have been separate, how much time has passed since we had our last common ancestor, right? And so what they show in those papers is that the relative genetic distance, let's say to the frontier, let's say it's the US, right? So if I'm more similar to the US, or let's say if I have spent less time separate from the US than you have, somehow I should be richer, because that means that my culture, my institutions should be more similar to the ones from the US, because we have had less time to diverge culturally and institutionally, right? And so we get this very nice results and sets of papers showing that somehow this relative distance to the technological frontier really is what seems to be explaining relative levels of comparative development, right? So what we wanted to do in this paper with Ani Harutyunyan, who was a student of mine, we wanted to understand, okay, this is telling me in a sense, if you and I are more different, if I'm less different from the frontier than you, then I will be richer than you. But we wanted to know, okay, but if I'm more different or more similar, in which sense, right? We want to know, because this may have implications for policy, right? And so what we're trying to do in the paper was, and like in the companion paper, was to see which of the cultural values of countries are correlated with genetic distances, right? What is it that we are capturing with these genetic distances? And by doing this, what we found is that there's a big problem when you try to do this with using culture. And I'm sure that if you try to do it with a measure of institution that you can also order somehow, is that the technological frontier in general tends to have the best cultural traits, the best institutional traits, right? And so it's going to be in the top or in the bottom of the distribution of traits that affect development. And if that's the case, you cannot distinguish the cultural difference from, let's say, the US with your actual level of that cultural trait, right? So let's say, imagine that it's really your level of time preference that affects development, right? Now, if the US, let's say, is the country with the best time preference for development, let's say it's the most patient country, then I cannot distinguish the effect of being similar to the US in terms of patients from my actual level of patients and its effect on development, right? And so in a sense, I cannot distinguish what we call the absolute effect versus the relative effect, right? And so that was kind of like the main result of the paper, where we were trying to understand which of these traits drive culture, but in a sense, we get the result that we cannot disentangle if it's really the level of the effect that matters, how similar I am to the frontier in that cultural trait or institutional trait.
Okay, so in simple terms, you cannot you cannot rightly say that it is the relative concentration of the trait or the absolute concentration of the trait that's affecting levels of development. Is this your
Exactly. So
point?
we
Okay.
don't know if I'm richer than you, or let's say you are richer than me, because you have, let's say, a level of patience more similar to the US, or is it because you just have more patience than I do? Because
Okay.
those two things are exactly the same, and the correlation between those two measures is basically one.
All right. I like your simple analysis. So, Omer, we have been speaking for a while. I'm enjoying the
Yes.
conversation, and
No,
you are
thank you.
enjoying the conversation. And I could speak for a longer time, but unfortunately, I have to wrap up. Omer,
Okay.
before I go, I will leave you with this. I think that I have $1 billion idea that can revolutionize finance, but I won't share it with the public as yet.
Okay. Good. Then keep me in the loop.
Yes, it can revolutionize finance and YouTube. Because you're not a libertarian, you may not like some of the
But that's the
proposals.
person you want, right? You want someone like me, or someone in the that will kind of poke holes in your argument
Yes,
to make it as good
but
as
it
possible.
is really, really radical and related to the global integration of capital. But it's a
Good.
pleasure speaking to you, but I have to go. So bye.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks for the
All right.
invitation. Take
Yes.
care.